that going? Okay, the ghostly machine has spoken. Um, today's conversation is going to be looking at how to discuss and bring in Wifredo Lam's 1941 painting, one of my favorite paintings actually, The Jungle. And to do this, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Dr. Mey-Yen Moriuchi, who is Associate Professor of Art History at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, and is the author of the acclaimed book, Mexican Costumbrismo, Race, Society, and Identity in 19th Century Art, among other publications. And she's got some really exciting work in process as well. And I'm very proud to say that she's also a longtime Smart History contributor, and we are very grateful for that. I'm going to let you take it away so we can maximize our time. I'm really excited. Before we do, I just want to say one last thing, which is just a little personal anecdote. When I worked at MoMA many years ago, this painting was hung in the sort of the area where the staff entered the building. And I think we were always a little bit many of the people working at the museum, but the Museum of Modern Art were a little bit, we wanted this in the galleries, and I'm happy to say it has been moved, although not currently on view, I understand at the moment, but it has been fairly recently. Anyway, with that, please take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming today, and thank you for having me as part of the Smart History, Common Histories webinar series. It's my pleasure to be here and to share some strategies for teaching Wifredo Lam's The Jungle. And I want to begin, and I usually begin in the classroom with projecting the artwork on a screen and just letting students sit with it for a while. I think it's a painting that requires some time to digest, if you will. And so I typically start by just having the students sit and look and observe. And I might prompt them with a writing activity or a game, I Spy game, or a writing activity where I have them, jot down the first thing that comes to mind when you look at the work, or perhaps write down objects that you see or you think you see, and then go back and add descriptive adjectives to those objects, encouraging students to expand their vocabulary and to think more critically and analytically at what they're looking at. So some responses, initial responses might be, it looks chaotic, or it appears claustrophobic. There's really, nowhere to go within the composition. It's dense, it's full of imagery. There are no empty spaces. It's mysterious. It's enigmatic. It's unlike a lot of anything maybe students have seen before. So trying to make sense of what you see is part of the process as well. So I encourage students to think about form. And so we might talk about the predominance of vertical lines, the verticality of the composition, the emphasis on the vertical through the sugarcane stalks that you see, as well as the hybrid figures, the anthropomorphic figures that are strewn throughout. There's slight diagonal lines with some of the stalks that suggest a slight sense of movement, but for the most part, we have an emphasis on verticality and a sort of stillness to the work. Also, the creation of space and the construction of space. It's very compressed. The foreground, midground, background is conflated, right? We have all the figures up against the picture plane. There is nowhere to move, right? There's nowhere to enter, exit. There's a little bit of the ground floor there in the foreground, but it's quite dense and compressed. And so that space that's filled with objects gives it that sense of claustrophobia, if you will. Students also respond often to color, and will be quick to comment on the preponderance of green used throughout the composition that evokes a jungle or a forest, a dense forest where you cannot see the sky or a few feet in front of you. And so the greenish yellows that are throughout are also notable. It lends a uniformity and unity to the composition. So I also will point out that the composition itself is quite large, right? So it's 94 by 90 inches. It's a painting that you can avoid if you're in front of it. It envelops you sensorially. It's meant to catch your eye, to cause you to keep looking, to provoke curiosity. And so the scale is something I try to recreate as well. In my classroom, it often is projected on a large screen, not exactly quite the scale, but certainly close to it. So students will get a sense of the size in the classroom. So all of these elements together, once we've discussed their first reactions to the work and they've started to notice some of the objects, we might point out that there are seemingly four, if we count the vertical figures that are comprised of these mask-like faces. So a horse one here on the left, a kind of tear-shaped one here next to it, the third one being over here, and then this crescent moon shape over here. And it's very difficult to discern which bodies belong to which mask-like face. And so after we make some of those formal visual observations, I bring in some contextual information. So what I'd like to share with you today are some thoughts about this artist, Wifredo Lam's connection and engagement with European modernism, with the particularly avant-garde movements of Cubism and Surrealism. I will also share his connections, or talk about his connections with Aimé Césaire and the Negritude movement, and his embrace of his Afro-Cuban culture, Santeria religion, but then also as part of that, his rejection of the picturesque and what was happening in Cuba, what was being created artistically in Cuba when he returns after an 18-year stay in Europe, is different from what he's trying to achieve artistically. I'll also share some artistic comparisons that I like to do in the classroom. So typically I teach a Latin American art course where I will cover Lam and Surrealism, but in addition, I'll have just talked about Mexican muralism and social realism, as well as other Latin American surrealists. So I find it fruitful to bring in some comparisons with other artists to do compare and contrast work. And then lastly, I'll offer some thoughts on the presence and the impact of Chinese culture and aesthetics on Lam's work. This has been an area that hasn't received a lot of scholarly activity. Typically, Lam's work is interpreted more in line with his Afro-Cuban traditions and identity. But he was also half Chinese, and this has been a subject of some research of mine over the past several years, so I'm going to share some thoughts and connections there. So first, just a little bit of background to familiarize yourselves with the artist if you're not, if you haven't encountered him before. He is from the northern part of Cuba. He was born in Sagua La Grande, which is in the northern province of Santa Clara. His father was Lam Yam. He was a Chinese immigrant from the southern part of China who arrived in Cuba in the latter third of the 19th century. This was following a wave of Chinese immigration in the mid-19th century, mid to latter part of 19th century, of about 150,000 Chinese coolies, which were basically indentured servants who came to work on the sugarcane plantations. Santa Clara was one of the main locations of sugar production. Lam's mother was a descendant of ancestors from Congo and Spain. So he grew up in a mixed race household. They lived in Chinatown in Sabana Grande, which was a thriving neighborhood of the city, not far from the predominantly African part of the neighborhood. He makes his way to Havana, which you see on the left-hand side there, as a young student, teenager, first to study law and then eventually art. And he demonstrates talent early in the arts and is able to secure some funding to travel to Europe. So he arrives in Spain first, in Madrid. And it's there that he encounters, the marvelous paintings in the Prado. Particularly impactful were Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, for example. He also encounters works by Picasso and Dali and others. And he eventually makes his way over to Paris. I should mention, he also fights in the Spanish Civil War and flees Spain to find refuge in Paris. And it's there that he develops friendships with Picasso and André Breton. So I'm showing you a few photographs to demonstrate their friendship, collegiality. On the left-hand side, of course, you see Picasso there with Lam. On the far right, you see a photograph of Breton and Lam. And in the center, a group of artists. Lam is there in the back, raising his arm. And it's a group of artists that had fled Paris after German occupation. They were in Marseille, awaiting passage to the West. And it's there that he really developed a strong friendship with André Breton and other surrealists, and they experimented playing all sorts of surrealist games. So early works in Paris demonstrate his experimentation with cubism, his flattening and simplification of the shapes into geometric forms, the lack of depth, the masks as well. He had seen Picasso's collection of African sculpture and was impacted by that. And so these early works show him experimenting with what he's encountering. Later, after some encounters with Breton and the surrealist thought, he creates works like these. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing a drawing and illustration that Lam did for André Breton's poem, Fata Morgana. He did hundreds of illustrations for that publication. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you a collective drawing by Lam, Breton, and others. The collective drawing, of course, the surrealists reveled in the uncanny juxtapositions of these collaged or drawings. And although we can't say for certain which of these vignettes was created by Lam, I venture to say that it's probable that the center vignette is by Lam, in which you see a Chinese man asleep next to a dragon mask with a clip of a railroad above them. And if the objective of these collective drawings was to tap into the unconscious mind, it is possible then that Lam's Chinese culture and identity was never far from his artistic and intellectual mind. On their way out of Marseille, the ship stops in Martinique, and it is there that Lam meets for the first time Aimé Césaire and is exposed to the ideas around the negritude movement and the kind of advocacy for a Black consciousness and reaffirmation of Black culture and heritage and identity in poetry and in art. He collaborates with Césaire in various occasions. Here I'm just showing you an illustration that he did for one of his publications, but that would serve as a long-term and fruitful collaboration for Lam. He arrives in Havana 1941 after spending about 18 years abroad. And he comments in interviews that he really didn't feel at home when he arrived back. He was having a hard time acclimating to what he saw as a colonialist mentality. He was also not fond of the aesthetic that was the art that was being produced by artists at the time, in the sense that the island was really catering to tourism. And so he says this quote that is often repeated. I refused to paint cha-cha-cha. I wanted to paint the drama of my country. But by thoroughly expressing the Negro spirit, the beauty of the plastic art of the Blacks, I knew I was running the risk of not being understood either by the man in the street or by the others. But a true picture has the power to set the imagination to work, even if it takes time. And I like this quote for a few different reasons. One is it shows his humor, but also his seriousness, his commitment to his vision, and also his openness to the imagination, right? And the way in which there are, that the power of the work, right, takes time for us to react and to understand it. And so a work like this, we talked about those feelings of the density of the composition and how those mass or those hybrid figures don't have a way out, right? They're compressed, they're entrapped, they are unable to be free. And so one of the ways in which we can look at this painting is to think about those that were working on those sugarcane plantations, the laborer that was working on those sugarcane plantations. Of course, slaves had been brought over from Africa for many, many years. But I also mentioned earlier how Chinese coolies were also brought over to work the sugarcane plantations in the middle of the 19th century, such that they suffered harsh conditions and violence, such that the painting, I think, becomes a representation of the oppression, the injustices experienced by the colored laborer. I think it's possible to understand this work as a critique of universal human oppression and kind of resonate with the plight of all human suffering, right? These are the laborers that are unable to get out. The sugarcane plantation, although here appears like a jungle, right? This is not in actuality how sugarcane is grown, but that sense of the jungle is the source of the oppression, right? We get that sense through his composition. Now there are elements of the composition, like the horse mask, for example, on the left-hand side, that I will refer to. I'll make some add additional thoughts to in just a few slides. The next few slides are going to suggest some comparisons that one might be able to do in the classroom. So I mentioned I often teach this artwork as a part of my Latin American art class. We talk about Mexican muralism and social realism just prior to surrealism. So students, I often discuss the work that you see here on the right. This is Diego Rivera's mural, one of his many murals in the Palacio de Cortes that he did in 1930. And so, you know, in comparing and contrasting, having students look at these two works side by side, we'll talk through the differences, which, you know, are many in terms of style. So we have the abstraction and fragmentation of forms on the left versus a more figural representational work on the right, a social realist work on the right. There is, I think, a emphasis on verticality in both. So in Rivera's, for example, you have the verticality commenting specifically on that social racial hierarchy, the bottom of which you have the indigenous laborers working, doing backbreaking labor. Then you have the overseers on their horse with their weapons. And then, of course, lastly, at the very top, you have the owner of the plantation just lounging. So although they differ stylistically, they share thematically, right? In this theme of the enslavement of the labor, the colored labor, the oppression and the injustices experienced by those of the working classes. Another comparison might be with Mario Carreno. He is a Cuban artist, friend of Lam's, also taking on the subject matter of sugarcane cutting, but again differs in terms of the energy. They share similarities in terms of, I would say, the color palette and the kind of maybe even the weapons here that you see with the blades. We have scissors over here, but this work with its repetition of shapes has more of a sense of dynamism, perhaps influenced by futurism. And as these figures look upward, perhaps a more optimistic outlook. Quickly, I'll just show you this comparison. Again, I'll talk during this unit, we'll look at many surrealist artists from Latin America. One of them might be Remedios Varo, who was a Spanish artist who settles in Mexico. And here, again, all the different, very different stylistically, we have illusionistic surrealism at its finest with Varo versus the abstraction of Lam. But again, teasing out maybe some potential, similarities, we do have on the part of both, we have these hybrid figures, but in the sense of Varo's, she's creating these birds out of alchemy, and she's setting them free, and perhaps there's a sense of that setting or wanting to set the figures free on the part of Lam. And then lastly, I want to say a few comments about the horse motif and its ties to, or its multiple connotations. So typically the horse in Lam's oeuvre has been interpreted as within an Afro-Cuban context. The horse can be interpreted as an incarnation of an orisha or a divine spirit. And its presence refers to the process of being possessed during a ceremony, a Santeria ceremony. The practitioner in Santeria is often referred to as the horse and undergoes a spiritual transformation. I'll point out, though, that in Chinese culture, the horse also has extreme poetic and political pictorial representation and connotations. It was an animal that was particularly revered in China because of its military and political usefulness. It also is an animal that was represented in many medium. Early masks like this one from around 1000 BC were worn by horses as protection, and they were believed to guide the believers on heavenly journeys. So I bring this in just to offer up some other possibilities for how we might interpret the horse motif, the horse figure in Lam's work. I certainly think there's some personal connections there to Chinese culture and traditions there. And then also, when Lam arrived in Cuba, again, after spending almost two decades abroad, he was with a woman who eventually marries Helena Holzer, who wrote a memoir and talking about how at this moment, Lam was obsessed and reading voraciously Oriental philosophies, and that he was obsessed with this number 3, the symbolism of 3. And so he creates paintings like these in which, as according to Holzer, can be read as representing the central figure of Tao, which is the conscious path, the one that is tied with nature, and on either side, the yin and the yang, the good and evil. Of course, other interpretations of this work, which again lead to its multiple readings, have been to see this left-hand figure as a femme cheval, again referring to Santeria, the rightmost figure with the double-X'd weapon as a Shango, the god of thunder, a warrior. and then the central figure as a legua, the Orisha of outcomes, of pathways forward. So I draw on a few different reference points there just to show the multiplicity, a potential multiplicity of meaning. And then just lastly, I'll say that I often, like to bring in other works by Lam to show the range of his work. So I might bring in something like The Eternal Presence or other works to do comparisons with The Jungle, and point to, again, the kind of presence, the engagement with European modernist movements, his embrace of African and Afro-Cuban traditions like Santeria, but also his Chinese roots, and to think about these works as expressing his transnational experiences. So with that, I'll end. I probably went a little bit too over, but I'm happy to take any questions from all of you.
That was absolutely wonderful and fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm personally very grateful to you for that introduction. We do have a few questions, and I've got my own as well. But one question is asking if you could unpack a little bit a reference that you made early in the talk about Lam's rejection of the picturesque, and a little bit about what the picturesque might have meant to him at that moment.
Yeah, great question. And I went through that kind of fast and didn't have all the images I would have liked to show. So at that time, Cuba was really catering to tourism, to an American audience. The U.S. was looming large in the kind of administration of Cuba. There was a lot of propaganda advertising Cuba as exotic, as kind of celebratory of the Afro-Cuban traditions, but in an I would say exotic way, which he found false and thought of as being false. And so you can see him really, instead of this work, you wouldn't, I don't think, describe it as being celebratory of Afro-Cuban traditions, unlike the work I showed. He's doing very much the opposite of that, right? He's critiquing the stereotypes that have proliferated about Cuba to, the imperialist powers, so to speak. And he's denouncing that way of seeing the island and its traditions.
Wonderful. Another question that just came in, any sense of the likelihood that Lam, by the mid-1940s, might have actually been able to see, and forgive my pronunciation, Taoshi or other stylized Chinese animal heads in art collections? Was that available, do you know, to him in the collections that he had access to in Paris or elsewhere?
Yeah, so that's a great question, one that proved elusive. So I don't have a direct or knowledge of or proof necessarily that he saw those Taoshi masks. Another connection, however, to the Taoshi mask, which I think is interesting to think about. His father, their memoir, in the memoirs, he recounts some instances where his father would create silhouettes of horses on the walls during Chinese festivals, but also the Taoshi and another term for a mythological beast of terror in China, Chonchi, were terms that were used to describe the slave masters, if you will, by the Chinese coolies in the 19th century. So trying to condense quickly the history of this, but during the 19th century, during the time period where the Chinese coolies were brought over as indentured servants, this trade ended because there was a commission, a report that was delving into, they were recording testimonies of the Chinese coolies against, to record the kind of harsh treatment they had received. And in those testimonies, the Chinese coolies refer to their oppressors as Taoshi and as Chonchi, as these mythological beasts of terror. And I think part of that kind of knowledge of these belief systems, these Chinese, this aspect would have been present in where and during Lam's life in the northern part of Cuba through oral testimonies. And, he certainly, I think, suffered at the, for racial discrimination for being not just Black, but also Chinese.
Thank you. How do you approach in the classroom navigating the use of abstraction as a vehicle for these complex issues, for universal human suffering, as you mentioned? How do you address that for students who might be looking for a sort of a more literal interpretation?
Yeah, great question as well. I mean, I think there might be a great comparison to look at Rivera's work in relation to something like this, where both of them in a way are representing that oppression, but doing so differently visually. And I asked students their reactions to that, right? Their kind of experience of receiving this pictorial vision of Lam's, if it's any more so or less critical than they see in something like Rivera's. And I think with the abstraction, there's always the risk of not understanding, right? There's, one of the reasons that Rivera returns to figuration after his experimentation with Cubism is because he wanted to more clearly narrate, his stories. So there's always the risk of losing something in translation, if you will, with abstraction. But with Lam, I feel like the distortion of the figures, the kind of menacing nature of the eyes that peer out behind the sugar cane, that sense of entrapment or the compression of space, like he uses form so well to convey that feeling of oppression. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but I feel like, no. Yeah.
No, it's great. I really appreciate that. It's such a complicated issue. And I want to go back to your mention of Santeria and the female horse figure for a moment. Can you just spend another moment on that so that I think everybody has a better sense of those issues?
Yeah, so in terms of the symbolism of the horse in Santeria, so there's been some really great and interesting, convincing research on this horse motif in Lam's work as being a reference to the practicant in a Santeria ceremony. So in a Santeria ceremony, the person that's being the practicant, they call it, is referred to as a horse, and is then during the ceremony possessed and undergoes a spiritual transformation. So it's that I guess description from Santeria that is being used to provide some meaning within that context. They refer, sometimes it's also referred as the transformation happens that the practicant, they call it bajarle el santo, they come down from the saint kind of embodies, I guess, the practicant. And so there's also a reference there. So it's really because of the way that the practicant is described as a horse during Santeria ceremonies. That's the reference.
That makes sense. Great. I appreciate that. And I think it's time to just thank you so much for all of your wonderful insights, and to remind everybody that we have another conversation in 2 weeks, so please join us. This was fascinating and answered an enormous number of my questions, and I want to now, I think I will feel much more confident teaching this thanks to your generosity. So thank you so much.